This photographer was called a peeping Tom, a criminal. Critics said his work was voyeuristic, predatory, and an assault on everything photography stood for. His name is Daido Moriyama, and he spent 60 years breaking every rule in the book. While other photographers chased perfect focus and crystal clear shots, he made his images deliberately grainy, blurry, and completely out of focus, and it made him a legend. But here's the thing, the same techniques that made him famous also got him into serious trouble. His street photography was so raw that people questioned whether he'd crossed the line from artist to voyeur. And then, in 1972, he published a book so radical it nearly destroyed his career and left him unable to pick up a camera for almost a decade. So keep watching, because what happened next changed street photography forever. And if you want to see how his controversial methods influenced the whole generation of photographers who followed in his footsteps, you won't want to miss this. To understand Daido Moriyama, you have to understand the world he came from. Born in 1938, his childhood was a nomadic one, constantly moving with his family across Japan. This wandering existence kept him from forming deep community roots, and instead, he found solace in exploring the streets of whatever new town he was in. This constant uprooting left him feeling like an outsider everywhere he went, a perspective that would later define his art. As he came of age, Japan was a nation grappling with its identity. The devastation of World War II was followed by rapid Americanization and economic growth, creating a powerful collision between tradition and modernity. The air was thick with tension, anxiety, and a raw, untamed energy. Moriyama's entry into photography wasn't a grand plan. It was almost an accident, but everything changed when he wandered into a local photo studio and saw something that stopped him cold. A single image that seemed to pulse with that active and groovy atmosphere he'd been searching for his entire life. In 1961, he moved to Tokyo and became an assistant to the renowned photographer Eiko Hosoe. But Moriyama's greatest inspirations came from outside the world of traditional Japanese photography. He was profoundly influenced by the raw, kinetic street photography of William Klein and the pop art philosophy of Andy Warhol, who saw beauty in duplication and mass production. He also found a kindred spirit in the ceaseless vagabond philosophy of Jack Kerouac. Klein showed him that streets could be battlegrounds, not just scenic backdrops. Warhol taught him that art didn't need to be precious. It could be mass-produced, disposable, democratic. And Kerouac gave him permission to wander without destination, to find meaning in movement itself. But Moriyama's real breakthrough didn't come from following these masters. It was come from joining a radical movement that would make him photography's most dangerous rebel. A movement with a name that literally meant to provoke. In 1968, Moriyama's world collided with a revolutionary new magazine, Provoke. This was an avant-garde publication that sought to free photography from its rigid, conventional confines and serve as provocative materials for thought. This was Moriyama's moment. But joining Provoke wasn't just about finding a platform, it was about finding a language for the chaos he'd been feeling his entire life. Moriyama became the living embodiment of the magazine's aesthetic. Are, Bure, Boke. These Japanese terms translate to grainy, blurry, out of focus. This wasn't a technical flaw, it was a deliberate philosophical stance. Moriyama embraced the chaos and imperfection of the urban world. Instead of striving for sharp, well-composed images, he used grain, blur, and harsh contrast as expressive tools. His technique was equally radical. He famously shot without looking through the viewfinder, pointing his camera in the general direction of his subject. This method was a statement. It rejected the idea that a photographer was a precise, detached observer, and instead embraced chance and instinct. Imagine walking through Tokyo's neon-soaked streets, camera raised, finger on the shutter, but never looking through that small window. You're shooting pure intuition, the sounds, the the energy, the gut feeling that something important is happening just outside your peripheral vision. The viewfinder wasn't just a limitation, it was a barrier between him and the raw electricity of the street. Moriyama's new approach was perfectly suited to the seedy underbelly of Tokyo. His early work explored the hidden, darker aspects of urban life, capturing subjects like Yakuza gangsters, nightclubs, and escorts. His first major photo book, Japan, a Photo Theatre, immediately established his reputation, presenting a theatrical and impressionistic take on the city's marginal subjects. His raw, unflinching style was making him famous, but it was also making him enemies. Critics were calling him a voyeur, a criminal with a camera. Each review felt like a personal attack. Here was an artist trying to capture the authentic pulse of his city, only to be told he was exploiting it. The weight of these accusations began to crush him, but he kept shooting, driven by something he couldn't yet articulate. But as the criticism mounted and his reputation became more controversial, Moriyama was about to encounter a subject that would become his mirror, a creature that, like him, existed on society's margins. And then he captured one image, a single photograph of a stray dog, that would define his career and nearly destroy his life. It was in 1971 that he captured his most famous image, Stray Dog Misawa. This image of a lone, gritty dog with a confrontational gaze became a powerful metaphor for Moriyama's own artistic and philosophical state. He saw himself as a wandering, instinctive observer on the margins of society. The stray dog became such a potent symbol that he would title several of his later books with variations on dog's memory. But success brought more scrutiny. The more famous the stray dog image became, the louder the critics grew. They dissected every frame he'd ever shot, questioning not just his technique, but his ethics. Was this art or exploitation? Photography or voyeurism? The attacks became so personal, so vicious, they called him a predator with a camera, someone who fed off society's vulnerable underbelly. For someone who had spent his entire life feeling like an outsider, this rejection by the artistic establishment hit differently. He began to question everything. What was he actually doing with this camera? What right did he have to capture these moments, these people, these fragments of life? These questions consumed him, and in 1972, they drove him to create what would become his most radical and self-destructive work, Farewell Photography. It was Moriyama's attempt to kill photography and perhaps himself as an artist along with it. The book was an act of artistic suicide. He took damaged negatives, rejected film strips, scratches, burns and solarized images, everything that traditional photography would discard, and presented them as the true essence of the medium. He instructed the publisher to print them however they saw fit, surrendering even the final creative control. If critics said his work was destructive, he would show them what destruction really looked like. But Farewell Photography wasn't just an attack on the medium. He was trying to push photography so far beyond its limits that it would either break completely or reveal some hidden truth. Instead, it broke him. The book's reception was brutal. Even his supporters didn't know what to make of it. Moriyama later reflected, "I tried to dismantle photography, but ended up being dismantled myself." The criticism that had driven him to create Farewell Photography now seemed gentle compared to the void that followed. He had proven his point, but at the cost of his artistic soul. For nearly a decade, one of photography's most prolific voices went silent. He couldn't pick up a camera without feeling the weight of his own destruction. The man who had captured the energy of an entire city now couldn't capture anything at all. He had become the ultimate stray dog, lost, wandering, with no clear path home. Most artists never recover from this kind of creative death. But sometimes, when you've destroyed everything you thought you knew about your art, you discover what was truly essential all along, and what Moriyama would discover in his silence would transform not just his work, but his entire understanding of what it meant to see. First time Daido Moriyama picked up a camera after his breakdown, his hands shook. It was 1981, 9 years since farewell photography had nearly destroyed him. The trigger for his return wasn't artistic inspiration or career pressure, it was something much simpler and more painful. His father was dying. What emerged wasn't the rebellious street photographer the world remembered, but someone entirely different, vulnerable, introspective, almost gentle. He began documenting his father's final days, then found himself drawn back to the places of his nomadic childhood. This became Memories of a Dog, not the aggressive provocation of his earlier work, but a son grappling with loss, memory, and the weight of time. The difference was striking. Where his earlier work had been about capturing the anonymous energy of strangers, this was intensely personal. Where he had once shot without looking, now every frame felt considered, almost precious. The man who tried to destroy photography was learning to use it for healing. But the art world had moved on. New photographers had claimed the streets he'd once dominated. Critics who had once called him dangerous now wondered if he was even relevant. The question haunted him. Could the artist who had once defined rebellion find meaning in quieter truths? The answer came in a form that was unexpected. In the late 1990s, Moriyama encountered something that reignited his passion: the compact digital camera. For Moriyama, it was liberation. Suddenly, he could shoot thousands of images without the cost of film, without the weight of equipment, without the formality that had paralyzed him. What followed was an explosion of creativity unlike anything in his earlier career. He was shooting again, constantly, obsessively, but with a difference. The anger was gone, replaced by curiosity. The rebellion had evolved into exploration. He embraced color photography, digital manipulation, even commercial work, not as compromises, but as new languages to speak old truths. When luxury brands like Yves Saint Laurent and Uniqlo asked to see his iconic stray dog image, many artists might have seen it as selling out. For Moriyama, it was vindication. The image that once symbolized his status as an outsider was now on t-shirts worn by teenagers in Tokyo. Photography, he realized, was never meant to be precious. It was meant to be lived with, worn, shared, democratized. The man who had spent a decade in silence had found his voice again, not by returning to who he was, but by discovering who he could become. But his greatest revelation was still ahead of him, because while Moriyama was quietly rebuilding his artistic soul, something extraordinary was happening in the streets he once walked alone. A whole generation of photographers had adopted his techniques. The grain, the blur, the raw energy he'd pioneered. The style that critics had once called an abomination was now being taught in photography schools worldwide. The question was, how would the master react when he realized that his most destructive period, the work that nearly killed his career, had secretly become his most influential? And what happens when a revolutionary discovers that revolution has become the establishment? So what became of the man who tried to destroy photography? His biggest failure became his greatest triumph. While we're all obsessing over crystal clear iPhone images and perfect Instagram filters, there's an entire generation of photographers doing the exact opposite, deliberately making their images grainy, blurry, and out of focus. They're using apps to recreate what Moriyama did by accident 60 years ago. The aesthetic that nearly destroyed his career is now worth millions to tech companies trying to make digital photos look authentic. Every time someone adds film grain to their Instagram or TikTok post, or chooses the blurry filter on VSCO, they're unconsciously channeling Daido Moriyama. The man critics called a criminal with a camera had accidentally predicted the future of visual culture. In a world drowning in digital perfection, people crave the imperfect, the raw, the real. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. When Moriyama sees young photographers copying his techniques, he doesn't claim ownership. Remember, this is the man who put his most famous image on t-shirts because he believed art should belong to everyone. He's watching his revolution become the establishment, and he's genuinely happy about it. Moriyama proves something that every creative person needs to hear. Your biggest disasters might be your most important work. The project that breaks you might be the one that changes everything. Sometimes you have to completely lose yourself to discover what you're truly capable of creating. In a world where AI can generate perfect images in seconds, Moriyama's work reminds us why we need human imperfection, why we need the blur, the grain, the happy accidents that happen when you stop trying to control everything and just let go. But Moriyama's story raises a question. What happens when a student becomes more extreme than a master? Tatsuo Suzuki took Moriyama's philosophy of shooting without looking and pushed it to its breaking point. Getting so close to strangers, his camera was almost touching their faces. The result? Some of the most controversial street photography ever created, and a technique so aggressive it's been banned in multiple cities. Click here to see how far one photographer was willing to go in the name of authentic street photography.